There is something about old buildings that most people walk past every single day without stopping to think about. If you live in a city with any real history, go downtown and look at the oldest buildings you can find. Look at the base. Look at the windows closest to the ground. In cities across North America, Europe, and Russia, you will find the same thing over and over again. Windows that sit at ankle level. Doors that open into walls of dirt. Archways that now serve as basement entries but were clearly designed to be ground floor entrances. Elaborate stonework and decorative facades half swallowed by the earth, visible only if you crouch down and look. This is not a rare occurrence. It is not limited to one city, one country, or one continent. You can find this in St. Petersburg. You can find it in Portland, Oregon. You can find it in Edinburgh, in Melbourne, in Budapest. Buildings that appear to have sunk into the ground or, depending on how you look at it, had the ground rise around them. And in many of these places, when construction crews dig down for modern utility work or foundation repairs, they find the same thing beneath the current street level. Older streets. Older sidewalks. Sometimes entire older floors of buildings, complete with windows, doors, and finished architectural detail that was clearly never meant to be underground. Now there are reasonable explanations for some of this. Cities do raise their street levels deliberately. Chicago is a well-documented example. In the 1850s and 1860s, the city literally jacked up entire blocks of buildings and filled in underneath to improve drainage and sewage flow. Seattle did something similar after its Great Fire in 1889. The old ground floors became basements, new streets were built on top, and life continued on a higher plane. These are historical facts, well recorded and not disputed. But here is where it gets interesting. Chicago and Seattle are the examples that get cited because they are well documented. The question is why the same buried floor pattern shows up in dozens of other cities where no such deliberate raising project is on record. Cities where the official history makes no mention of any large-scale ground-level change, yet the physical evidence is right there in the architecture. Windows below grade. Doors to nowhere. Decorative elements buried in soil that were obviously meant to be seen and admired from the street. Take a walk through certain neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Cincinnati, or Richmond. Look at buildings from the early to mid-1800s. You will notice that many of them have what appear to be full stories below the current street, accessible only through narrow stairwells that were clearly added later. The original main entrances are underground. The brickwork and stone detailing continues below the surface, identical in quality and style to what is visible above. These were not basements. They were ground floors. In Russia, the pattern is even more pronounced. Buildings in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kazan show buried first floors with ornate window frames, carved stone details, and proportions that make no sense if they were designed to be below ground. During renovation work in several Russian cities, workers have uncovered entire arcaded walkways and street-level shop fronts meters below the modern surface. The standard explanation when one is offered at all is sediment accumulation over time. Soil builds up, streets get paved over repeatedly, and gradually the ground level rises. This is a real process, and it does happen. But sediment accumulation that buries an entire floor of a building typically takes centuries, not decades. And many of these buildings are dated to the early 1800s, meaning this burial would have had to occur in a remarkably short window of time. So we are left with a straightforward observation. Across multiple continents, in cities with very different climates, geologies, and histories, there is a consistent physical pattern. Buildings from roughly the same era show evidence of significant ground-level change that buried their original first floors. In some places this is well explained. In many others, the explanation is either incomplete or simply absent from the record. This does not prove anything on its own. But it is a measurable, visible, documentable pattern. And it is the right place to start. Once you start paying attention to the physical evidence in these buildings, a second pattern begins to stand out, and this one has to do with timing. A surprising number of these buried structures, these cities with underground first floors and raised street levels, share something else in common. Their official histories cluster around the same narrow window of time, roughly the 1830s through the 1850s. This is the period when many major cities across the Western world underwent dramatic transformation. Entire urban centers were rebuilt, reorganized, or supposedly constructed from scratch. And in many cases, the scale and speed of this transformation raises legitimate questions when you compare what was reportedly built against the tools, labor, and logistics that were available at the time. Consider the timeline of American cities. Many major urban centers in the United States have founding narratives that place their major growth phase right in this window. Cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, and San Francisco all have official histories that describe explosive growth during the 1830s and 1840s. Towns that were supposedly little more than frontier outposts one decade became sprawling cities with grand civic architecture, paved streets, and complex infrastructure the next. Early photographs from the 1850s and 1860s, some of the first photographic records we have of these cities, show something that does not quite match the pioneer narrative. Instead of rough frontier towns gradually building up, we see fully realized urban landscapes. Stone and brick buildings with classical columns, ornate cornices, arched windows, and elaborate facades. Multi-story structures lining wide boulevards. The kind of architecture that in Europe took generations to develop appears in these photographs as though it simply materialized. Now, photographs can be misleading. A single image captures one moment and tells you nothing about what came before. It is entirely possible that these cities did grow that fast, that skilled builders and architects flooded into new territories and produced remarkable work in a short period. The Gold Rush era and westward expansion certainly brought massive population movements. But the pattern is worth noting because it repeats so consistently. Across the Atlantic, a similar timeline plays out. Major European cities underwent enormous reconstruction projects in this same era. Paris under Haussmann in the 1850s and 1860s is the most famous example, where entire medieval neighborhoods were demolished and replaced with the wide boulevards and uniform stone buildings we associate with the city today. But similar projects occurred in Vienna, Berlin, Barcelona, and numerous other cities during the same decades. Old city centers were torn down and rebuilt at a scale that reshaped the urban landscape entirely. There is another element within this timeline that deserves attention. The 1830s and 1840s saw an enormous surge in institutional construction across North America and Europe. Orphanages, asylums, poorhouses, and foundling hospitals were built in huge numbers during this period. The orphan train movement in the United States, which ran from 1854 to 1929, relocated an estimated 250,000 children from eastern cities to the Midwest and West. The official explanation is that these were children of immigrants living in urban poverty, and that is certainly true for many of them. But the sheer scale of the displacement, combined with incomplete records about the origins of many of these children, has raised questions that historians themselves have acknowledged are difficult to fully resolve. Census records from this period also present challenges. The United States conducted censuses in 1830, 1840, and 1850, but the 1890 census was almost entirely destroyed in a fire in 1921. This means there is a significant gap in population data for the late 19th century, precisely the period when many of these urban transformations were reaching their peak. The loss of the 1890 census is well documented and officially attributed to an accidental fire in the Commerce Department building. But the practical effect is that an enormous amount of demographic data from this critical period is simply gone. Municipal records from many cities during the 1830s and 1840s are also sparse or missing. Founding documents, early construction permits, land surveys, and civic records from this era are frequently incomplete, damaged, or absent from archives. Again, this is not unusual for records from nearly 2 centuries ago. Paper deteriorates, fires destroy archives, and early municipal governments were not always meticulous about record keeping. But the cumulative effect is that for a period defined by massive and rapid urban development, the documentary record is often thinner than you might expect. What we can observe is this. There is a concentrated period in the mid-1800s where cities across the Western world underwent transformations of remarkable scale and speed. The physical infrastructure that emerged from this period is still standing in many places, and its sophistication often seems at odds with the resources and timelines attributed to its creation. Population movements and institutional responses during this same window were enormous. And the documentary record, while not empty, contains gaps and inconsistencies that make it difficult to build a complete picture of exactly how all of this unfolded. None of this constitutes proof of anything beyond what is stated. But the clustering of all these elements in the same narrow historical window is itself a pattern worth examining. Of all the observable evidence related to this subject, the architecture itself is the most difficult to reconcile with standard historical narratives. Not because the buildings could not have been built when they are said to have been built, but because the logistics of their construction, given the tools, transportation, and labor available at the time, raise questions that rarely receive satisfactory answers. Start with the American Midwest in the 1830s and 1840s. Cities like Columbus, Indianapolis, and Nashville were, according to their official histories, relatively young settlements during this period. Many had been incorporated as towns only a decade or two earlier. Yet by the 1840s and 1850s, these cities possessed grand civic buildings that would not look out of place in London or Rome. State capitals with massive stone columns, domed rotundas, and classical proportions. Courthouses with elaborate stonework and symmetrical facades. Banks and commercial buildings with carved ornamental details that required highly skilled masons. The question is not whether such buildings could be constructed. Obviously they could, because they exist. The question is about the supply chain. Where did the stone come from? How was it transported to frontier locations where rail networks were still incomplete or non-existent? How many skilled stonemasons, carvers, architects, and laborers would have been required, and where did they come from in towns with populations of just a few thousand? How long would such construction realistically take given the technology of the period? These are straightforward engineering and logistics questions, and in many cases the answers in the historical record are vague or simply not addressed. Official histories tend to focus on who commissioned the building and when it was completed, not on the practical details of how thousands of tons of cut stone were transported and assembled in a pre-industrial frontier setting. The pattern extends well beyond civic buildings. In cities and towns across North America, you can find commercial blocks from the mid-1800s built in a style that historians call Italianate, or Second Empire. These buildings feature elaborate bracketed cornices, arched windows with carved stone hoods, decorative pilasters, and in many cases cast iron facades of remarkable intricacy. They appear in small towns that, according to the historical record, had only recently been carved out of wilderness. The consistency of style across enormous distances is itself noteworthy. Nearly identical architectural details show up in towns separated by thousands of miles, in an era before standardized architectural plans were widely distributed and before rail networks could easily move materials and craftsmen across the continent. One explanation is that pattern books, published collections of architectural designs, were widely available and allowed local builders to replicate fashionable styles. This is documented and certainly played a role. But pattern books tell you what to build, not how to build it. The execution of carved stone details, the casting of elaborate iron facades, and the structural engineering of large masonry buildings all require specialized skills and materials that go well beyond following a printed design. The World's Fairs present perhaps the most striking version of this question. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago is the most frequently cited example. The official history states that the fairgrounds, known as the White City, were designed and constructed in approximately 2 years. The complex included over 200 buildings, many of them enormous. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building alone covered more than 30 acres and was at the time the largest building in the world by footprint. According to the official narrative, these were temporary structures built primarily of a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber applied over wooden and steel frames. They were designed to look like grand classical buildings, but were essentially elaborate facades meant to last only for the duration of the fair. After the exposition closed, most were demolished or destroyed by fire in 1894. This explanation is documented and supported by contemporary accounts, photographs of the construction process, and records from the architects and engineers involved, including Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted. So there is a historical basis for the official narrative. But several aspects continue to generate questions. The scale is one issue. Even with staff construction, building over 200 structures including multiple buildings of enormous size, landscaping an entire park, installing electrical lighting throughout, and building a functioning rail system to transport visitors, all in roughly 24 months, represents a logistical achievement that is rarely examined in proportion to its difficulty. Contemporary accounts describe thousands of workers on site, but the coordination required to complete a project of this magnitude in this timeframe, using 1890s technology, is remarkable by any standard. The demolition is another point of interest. Nearly all of these grand structures were torn down within a year or two of the fair's closing. The Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, originally the fair's Palace of Fine Arts, is one of the few surviving structures, and notably it is built of actual brick and stone, not staff. If the other buildings were truly temporary plaster structures, their demolition makes practical sense. But the speed and thoroughness with which the White City was erased from the physical landscape has drawn attention from researchers who note that very little structural evidence remains for independent examination. Similar questions surround other World's Fairs of the era. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis covered over 1,200 acres and included more than 1,500 buildings. Again, these were reportedly temporary structures, and again, virtually all of them were demolished after the fair concluded. The pattern repeats with expositions in Buffalo, San Francisco, Portland, and numerous other cities. Grand architectural complexes built at extraordinary speed, displayed briefly, and then removed almost entirely. The consistency of the architectural style across all of these events is also notable. Classical columns, domed rotundas, arched colonnades, and ornate sculptural programs appear at every major exposition, regardless of the host city or the ostensible theme. The aesthetic is remarkably uniform, drawing heavily on Greco-Roman and Renaissance forms. This was the dominant architectural fashion of the period, so stylistic consistency is not inherently suspicious. But the sheer volume of construction in this style, appearing almost simultaneously across multiple continents, represents a coordination of design, materials, and skilled labor that is worth examining on its own terms. In Europe, a parallel pattern exists. Grand civic buildings, train stations, opera houses, and government complexes built during the mid to late 1800s display a level of craftsmanship and material quality that even modern construction firms would find challenging to replicate. The stonework in buildings like the Budapest Parliament, completed in 1904, or the Vienna State Opera, completed in 1869, involves millions of individually carved stone elements assembled with extraordinary precision. These buildings are thoroughly documented in terms of their commission and completion, but the practical details of their construction, the quarrying, transport, carving, and assembly of such enormous quantities of finished stone, often receive less attention in the historical record than you might expect for projects of this scale. None of this proves that the official construction histories are wrong. Buildings can be built quickly when enough resources are committed. Skilled labor was available, pattern books did circulate, and the 19th century was genuinely a period of rapid industrial and architectural development. But the questions are legitimate. When you examine the logistics rather than just the timelines, when you ask not just when but how, gaps in the explanatory record become visible. And those gaps deserve honest acknowledgement rather than dismissal. To examine this subject fairly, it is necessary to look at what was actually happening in the world during the early to mid-1800s, because the period was defined by disruption on a scale that is easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. The early 19th century was a time of significant geological and climatic instability. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815 was one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history. It ejected enormous quantities of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, causing what became known as the Year Without a Summer in 1816. Temperatures dropped across the northern hemisphere. Crops failed throughout Europe and North America. Famine, disease, and mass migration followed. The social and economic disruption lasted well beyond a single year, and its effects rippled through the following decades. This is important context because volcanic eruptions of this magnitude do not just affect weather. They produce massive quantities of fine particulate matter that settles over vast areas. Heavy ashfall from major eruptions can bury structures, alter landscapes, and deposit layers of sediment that accumulate rapidly, far faster than normal geological processes would allow. Tambora was not the only significant eruption of this period. Several other notable volcanic events occurred in the early 1800s, and the cumulative atmospheric and geological effects of these eruptions are still being studied. Flooding was also a major feature of this era. The Mississippi River experienced catastrophic floods in 1811, 1813, 1826, and 1844. The Ohio River flooded repeatedly. European rivers including the Danube, the Rhine, and the Elbe saw major flood events throughout the first half of the 19th century. These floods deposited enormous quantities of mud and sediment across wide areas, burying low-lying structures and permanently altering ground levels in many locations. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 were among the most powerful seismic events ever recorded in North America. The series of quakes, centered in what is now southeastern Missouri, were strong enough to temporarily reverse the flow of the Mississippi River, create new lakes, and cause the ground to liquefy over large areas. Liquefaction, the process by which saturated soil loses its structure during seismic activity and behaves like a fluid, can cause buildings to sink into the ground. The effects of these earthquakes were felt across an enormous geographic area, and their long-term impact on the landscape of the central United States is well documented in geological studies. So when we look at the physical evidence of buried first floors and altered ground levels in cities across this region and this time period, there are natural explanations that account for at least some of what we observe. Volcanic ashfall, river flooding, earthquake-induced liquefaction, and normal sediment accumulation can all contribute to the burial of structures over time. The question is whether these known events are sufficient to explain the full extent and consistency of the pattern, or whether additional factors remain unidentified. The deliberate raising of city streets is another documented practice from this period that deserves full consideration. Chicago's street raising project in the 1850s and 1860s is the most famous example, but it was not unique. Cities across the United States and Europe raised their street levels during the 19th century to improve drainage, manage sewage, and reduce the impact of flooding. In many cases, this involved filling in around existing buildings, effectively turning ground floors into basements. This is a well-documented urban engineering practice, and it explains the buried floor pattern in numerous specific locations. What it does not explain is why this same pattern appears in locations where no street raising project is documented. And it does not explain why the architectural details on these buried floors are often of equal or superior quality to the visible portions of the building, suggesting they were designed to be seen and occupied, not to serve as foundations or below-grade storage. The mid-1800s was also a period of deliberate historical record-keeping reform in many countries. National archives were established, census practices were standardized, and municipal record-keeping became more systematic. This means that records from before this period are often less complete, not because they were deliberately destroyed, but because the systems for creating and preserving them were less developed. The gaps in the documentary record from the early 1800s are real, but they may reflect the transition from informal to formal record-keeping rather than anything more significant. It is also worth noting that the 19th century was a period of genuine and unprecedented industrial expansion. The development of railroads, steam power, standardized manufacturing, and new construction techniques did make it possible to build at a scale and speed that would have been impossible a generation earlier. The rapid growth of American cities during this period, while striking, occurred alongside a genuine revolution in construction technology and transportation infrastructure. Cast iron structural elements could be mass-produced in foundries and shipped by rail. Standardized brick manufacturing increased output dramatically. Portland cement, patented in 1824, made large-scale masonry construction faster and more reliable. These developments provide real and substantial context for the rapid urban growth of the mid-1800s. They do not answer every question, particularly regarding the earliest years of this period when rail networks were still nascent and industrial capacity was limited. But they form an essential part of the picture, and must be weighed alongside the physical anomalies and documentary gaps. The honest assessment is that the historical context provides partial explanations for the patterns we observe. Natural disasters, deliberate engineering projects, and industrial development all account for some of what we see. But they do not account for all of it, and the consistency of the pattern across such a wide geographic and cultural range remains a feature that resists simple or singular explanation. So where does this leave us? We have walked through physical observations, historical timelines, architectural questions, and the broader context of the period. Some of what we have examined has clear and well-documented explanations. Some of it does not. The physical evidence is real. Buried first floors, underground entryways, and below-grade architectural details exist in cities across multiple continents. In some cases, deliberate street-raising projects or natural geological events account for this. In other cases, no specific explanation is offered in the available historical record. The timeline clustering is real. A concentrated period of massive urban construction, institutional expansion, and population displacement occurred across the Western world during the 1830s through the 1850s. Industrial development and migration patterns explain part of this. But the scale, speed, and architectural sophistication of what was built during this window continue to raise legitimate logistical questions. The architectural anomalies are real. Buildings of remarkable complexity in craftsmanship appear in locations and timeframes where the available labor, materials, and transportation infrastructure seem insufficient to explain them. Pattern books and industrial advances account for some of this. The full logistics of construction are often absent from the historical record. The documentary gaps are real. Missing records, destroyed census data, and incomplete municipal archives from this period are acknowledged by mainstream historians. These gaps may reflect nothing more than the imperfect record-keeping of an earlier era. But they do make it more difficult to verify or challenge the standard narratives with the level of detail that the subject seems to demand. What is important to recognize is the distinction between identifying these patterns and drawing conclusions from them. A buried first floor is an observation. A missing record is a fact. An unusually rapid construction timeline is a logistics question. None of these things, individually or collectively, prove that the established historical narrative is wrong. What they do is identify areas where the narrative is incomplete, where the explanations offered do not fully account for the evidence available, and where further examination would be valuable. The MudFlood theory, as it circulates online, often fills these gaps with a specific narrative involving a global catastrophic event and a deliberate reset of civilization. That is an interpretation. It is one way to connect the dots between the patterns described in this video. But it is not the only way, and it is important to be honest about the difference between what we can observe and what we choose to infer. There may be entirely conventional explanations for every anomaly discussed here that simply have not yet been widely published or popularized. There may be geological studies, construction records, or engineering analyses sitting in archives and academic journals that address these questions thoroughly. If so, they deserve wider attention. And if not, then the questions themselves deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed simply because they are uncomfortable or unconventional. The purpose of this examination has not been to tell you what to believe. It has been to show you what is observable, what is documented, what is missing, and where the boundaries between evidence and interpretation actually lie. If you walk away from this with nothing else, walk away with the habit of looking at old buildings differently. Look at the base. Look at the windows. Look at the ground level. Ask yourself what you are seeing, and whether the explanation you have been given fully accounts for it. History is not a closed book. It is a record that is always being revised, corrected, and expanded as new evidence surfaces and old assumptions are re-examined. The buildings are still standing. The questions are still open. And the willingness to look carefully, without rushing to conclusions in either direction, remains the most honest starting point there is.